Have you ever had the sense that your childhood didn't exactly end? It just went quiet? Not loud trauma, not chaos every day, just a subtle, ongoing feeling that you were standing in the middle of something unfinished, listening, translating, adjusting, as if you were raised not inside a home, but between two emotional climates that no longer shared air. For many children of divorce, the rupture isn't only the separation itself. It's the psychological borderland that follows. Divorce becomes less a family event and more a permanent internal geography. Two worlds, two emotional nations, separate rules, separate languages, unresolved grievances. And the child, without being asked, becomes the translator, the bridge, the neutral zone where tension is stored so it doesn't explode elsewhere. This is not about blame. It's about position. When adults cannot metabolize their grief, their anger, or their disappointment, those emotions don't disappear. They migrate. And very often, they migrate into the most adaptive nervous system in the room, the child's. Not because the child is weak, but because the child is open, plastic, responsive, capable of holding what others cannot. Over time, a symbolic role reversal takes shape. The child becomes the container for adult emotions, not through words alone, but through tone, timing, and silence. You learn when not to ask questions, when to soften your voice, when to be easy, when to carry information carefully from one house to the other, editing not just facts, but feelings. This is how responsibility enters the body early, not as choice, but as atmosphere. Culturally, this often goes unnamed. We speak about amicable or functional divorce, as if the absence of open conflict means the absence of impact. But function is not the same as integration. A family can function while still fracturing a child's inner continuity, especially when the child learns, implicitly, that their emotional needs must stay small so the larger structure doesn't crack again. Many children internalize an unspoken contract at this point. It's rarely conscious, but it's deeply binding. If I stay small, no one breaks again. If I don't need too much, if I don't feel too loudly, if I don't take sides. This contract doesn't feel like self-erasure when you're young. It feels like love, like loyalty, like maturity beyond your years. But it quietly shapes how safety is defined in the nervous system. Safety becomes associated with self-containment, with vigilance, with staying ahead of emotional weather rather than resting inside it. There's a useful mythic image here, not to romanticize the experience, but to clarify it. Imagine a child raised like Mercury, always moving, always carrying messages between gods who refuse to meet. Quick, clever, attuned, never fully at rest. Mercury survives by agility, not by grounding. He belongs everywhere and nowhere at once. Many children of divorce grow up this way, highly perceptive, emotionally intelligent, sensitive to shifts in mood and energy, often praised for being so mature. But maturity gained through necessity is not the same as sovereignty. It's competence without choice, awareness without protection. And none of this means your parents failed you as people. It means they were human inside a system that offered little guidance for emotional repair. As someone like Dr. Gabor Mate would caution, trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you when what you needed wasn't available. The body remembers conditions, not intentions. If any of this resonates, notice what happens in your body right now. Perhaps a tightening in the chest, a familiar alertness behind the eyes, or a quiet recognition that doesn't need words. There's no need to analyze it away. Just let it be present. This is not about reopening wounds. It's about naming the terrain you learned to survive in. Because what begins as adaptation rarely stays in the past. The strategies that once kept connection intact often migrate into adulthood, into intimacy, leadership, and self-definition. And midway through this conversation, we'll expose a pattern many adults from divorced homes repeat, not because it's their preference, but because it's their conditioning. For now, simply stay here, not fixing, not judging, just noticing what it meant to grow up between two worlds that never spoke again. There is a particular kind of wound that doesn't feel like loss at first. It feels like duty. When a child grows up between two parents who can no longer stand together, love quietly becomes something that must be managed, not expressed freely, but distributed carefully. Affection turns into a resource that could provoke jealousy, resentment, or withdrawal if handled the wrong way. And so the child learns to ration it, to divide it, to keep it balanced. This is where the loyal child archetype takes shape. On the surface, loyalty looks virtuous. It looks like devotion, responsibility, and moral strength. But underneath, something more fragile is forming. The central fear is no longer abandonment in the usual sense. It becomes the fear of betrayal, the fear that choosing one truth, one preference, or one emotional reality will wound someone else. Love starts to feel conditional on neutrality. From a Jungian lens, this creates a fracture in what he called the parent complex. Instead of one integrated internal authority, the psyche absorbs two incompatible voices. Each carries its own rules, values, and emotional gravity. Inside, there is no shared counsel, only alternating commands. Be strong here, be soft there, agree now, disappear later. Over time, the child doesn't ask, "What do I feel?" They ask, "Who can I afford to disappoint least?" The nervous system adapts accordingly. Early relational stress conditions the body toward hypervigilance. Cortisol becomes familiar. Attention sharpens around emotional shifts, micro-expressions, changes in tone. The child learns to read the room before reading themselves. Safety becomes predictive rather than grounded. This is not pathology. It is intelligence shaped by necessity. Yet, there is a quiet cost. When loyalty becomes the organizing principle of love, individuation, the process of becoming a self rather than a role, begins to stall. Jung never framed individuation as selfishness. He described it as psychological adulthood, the ability to hold one's own center without needing to fragment to stay connected. Here's the paradox. Loyalty feels moral, but when it replaces self-definition, it slowly suffocates it. The psyche learns that wholeness is dangerous, that choosing oneself risks collapse elsewhere. So the self remains split, not out of weakness, but out of devotion. There is an old cultural image that captures this tension well. Imagine a samurai sworn to serve two feudal lords who are enemies. Honor demands loyalty to both. Survival demands appeasement. But action becomes paralysis. Every move risks betrayal. Stillness becomes the only safe stance. Many adults carry this stance forward. They appear composed, reasonable, and fair. But inside, there is chronic tension. Decisions feel heavy. Conflict feels catastrophic. Not because disagreement is intolerable, but because it threatens an old internal equilibrium, built on holding opposing forces apart. The trigger underneath is deceptively simple. Fear of loss, paired with fear of losing control. Not control over others, but control over stability, over coherence, over the fragile peace that once depended on your emotional restraint. And this divided loyalty does not dissolve with age. It mutates. It shows up in intimacy, where attraction leans toward partners who recreate familiar tension. It shows up in leadership, where responsibility is overcarried and resentment grows quietly. It shows up in friendships, where needs are hinted at but rarely claimed directly. None of this means something is wrong with you. It means something once worked. As someone like Dr. Gabor Mate might gently remind us, adaptation is not the same as choice. The body and psyche learned a strategy before they had language or consent. That strategy deserves respect, even as its limitations become clearer. If you notice a familiar tightness here, a sense of being pulled in two directions even now, there's no need to resolve it. Just recognize it. The loyal child does not disappear by force. It loosens when safety no longer depends on division. And 2 chapters from now, we'll test this pattern against what happens when this internal split finally meets adult intimacy and begins to crack under the weight it was never meant to carry. For now, let this idea settle. Love that had to be divided learned how to survive. But survival is not the same as living whole. There is a quiet confusion many adults carry without ever naming it. They finally encounter calm, someone consistent, emotionally available, predictable in a good way. And instead of relief, something feels off. Flat, empty, almost unreal. The connection feels polite but lifeless, as if something essential is missing. And then, elsewhere, chaos appears. Intensity, uncertainty, emotional volatility. And suddenly the body wakes up. Thoughts sharpen, desire ignites. There is a feeling of being alive again. This contrast is not a character flaw. It is an attachment imprint. When early bonds are inconsistent, the nervous system never fully learns what a stable home base feels like. Safety exists, but it arrives intermittently. Connection is followed by rupture, warmth by withdrawal. Over time, the body adapts by staying alert rather than settled. Calm becomes unfamiliar, and unfamiliar often registers as unsafe. What happens next is subtle but powerful. Calm relationships begin to feel empty, not because they lack depth, but because they don't activate the same internal chemistry. Chaos, on the other hand, feels vivid, charged, meaningful. The body mistakes activation for intimacy. At the core of this pattern is a wound of inconsistency. Attachment without reliability creates a loop of compulsive validation. Attention becomes proof of worth. Emotional intensity becomes reassurance. And when intensity fades, anxiety rises. Not because love is gone, but because regulation has nothing to lean on. Neuroscience helps illuminate this without reducing it to biology. In unstable attachment environments, dopamine spikes often replace oxytocin regulation. Dopamine is the chemistry of anticipation and pursuit. Oxytocin is the chemistry of bonding and rest. When bonding is unreliable, anticipation takes over. Instability becomes arousing. Waiting becomes familiar. This is why what feels like chemistry is often nervous system recognition. The body recognizes a pattern before the mind evaluates a person. It is not choosing chaos. It is choosing familiarity. Many people describe this realization only after years of repetition. Stories appear again and again in survivor forums. Stable partners described as kind, present, even loving, yet somehow ungraspable. Then emotionally volatile partners who consume attention, provoke anxiety, and feel impossible to leave. Not because they are healthier, but because they keep the nervous system engaged in a way that resembles early bonding. The trigger underneath is layered. Repetition of trauma, combined with rejection sensitivity. Each withdrawal reactivates the original uncertainty. Each reunion provides relief. The cycle mimics repair, even when no true repair occurs. Over time, this doesn't just shape dating choices. It reshapes identity. You begin to define yourself as someone who needs intensity to feel real. Someone who associates peace with boredom. Someone who feels most themselves when something is at stake. And yet, there is often a quiet exhaustion beneath it. A sense that being on all the time is costing something. That rest feels earned only after emotional labor. That presence without performance is strangely difficult to tolerate. This is where clarity matters. Not to judge the pattern, but to see it. Calm did not fail you. Calm was never modeled as safe long enough for your body to trust it. Chaos did not excite you because it was better. It excited you because it was known. As Jung observed, the psyche repeats what it does not yet understand. Not to punish, but to complete. The repetition carries information. It asks to be translated, not eradicated. If any part of you recognizes this, if the idea that safety can feel suspicious lands with a quiet weight, notice what happens internally. Perhaps there is resistance, perhaps grief, perhaps relief at having words for something long felt, but never articulated. This is not the end of the pattern. It is the place where awareness begins to loosen its grip. Because when the nervous system learns that peace is not boring, that it is simply unfamiliar, it gains the possibility of a different orientation. Not immediately, not by force, but gradually, as regulation replaces vigilance. Peace is not boring. It is your nervous system remembering safety. And as we move forward, this biochemical bias will meet another layer of adaptation, one that looks like strength, maturity, and discipline, but often hides a much earlier loss. There is a moment many men look back on and quietly misname as pride. The moment they realized they could handle things, that they were reliable, that when situations became unstable, they stepped forward instead of falling apart. It often sounds like strength in retrospect, maturity, leadership, but timing matters. When adulthood arrives too early, it doesn't arrive as sovereignty. It arrives as necessity. The child does not choose responsibility. Responsibility chooses the child. And what forms is not grounded authority, but hyper-responsibility. a posture of constant readiness shaped by the absence of containment. Underneath this pattern is unprocessed grief, not the kind that cries loudly, but the kind that never had permission to exist. Overfunctioning becomes a way to outrun it. If everything is managed, optimized, and under control, then nothing painful has space to surface. Efficiency becomes anesthesia. From an archetypal perspective, this resembles what could be called the premature king, a figure crowned before his inner kingdom is unified. He carries authority without sovereignty, power without rest. He governs through vigilance rather than presence. His strength is real, but it is brittle. Philosophers have warned about this kind of strength for centuries. Nietzsche, in particular, cautioned against identities built on suppression rather than integration. When vitality is forced underground, it does not disappear. It hardens. It turns rigid. What looks like discipline on the outside can conceal exile on the inside. This pattern shows up across cultures, especially in post-conflict households. Eldest sons often step into emotional leadership roles long before they are resourced for them. They mediate, stabilize, provide. They become the pillar. But pillars are not meant to feel. They are meant to hold. And so feeling becomes dangerous. Vulnerability is postponed. Grief is delayed indefinitely. The nervous system learns that worth comes from function, not from being. That rest must be justified. That softness threatens collapse. The reframe here is subtle, but essential. Discipline without emotional permission does not produce mastery. It produces rigidity. Mastery includes flexibility, recovery, and self-trust. Rigidity survives by control alone. Perfectionism often enters quietly at this stage, disguised as virtue. High standards, self-reliance, stoicism without integration. The man becomes admirable, dependable, and increasingly alone inside his own structure. The trigger beneath it all is fear. Fear that if responsibility loosens, everything will fall apart again. Fear that grief, once allowed, will overwhelm. Fear that stepping back means abandoning something fragile that still depends on you. And yet, this early adulthood does not remain contained to work or family roles. It shapes how power is expressed later. Control begins to masquerade as leadership. Direction replaces dialogue. Stability becomes something imposed rather than shared. This is where the pattern begins to strain under its own weight, because no system built on emotional exile can sustain intimacy, and no man can lead himself indefinitely without access to the full range of his inner life. There is often a quiet reckoning here, a sense that what once worked is now costing too much, that the very strength that carried you through childhood is now interfering with connection, with meaning, with rest. Ahead, we will confront the moment many men arrive at reluctantly, the realization that their strength was real, but incomplete, built to survive, not to belong. There is a belief that often lives beneath the surface, rarely spoken aloud, yet deeply trusted. If I manage everything, nothing collapses. It sounds reasonable, even responsible, especially for someone who learned early that stability was fragile and easily lost. Control becomes a way of holding the structure together from the inside, a way of preventing surprise, a way of staying ahead of rupture. But psychologically, control is not the same as power. It is far more often a trauma response. When safety once depended on vigilance, the nervous system learns to equate relaxation with danger. Letting go feels irresponsible. Delegating feels risky. Trusting others feels like inviting chaos back in. So the system tightens. Boundaries become rigid rather than clear. Flexibility narrows into certainty. From a Jungian perspective, what is disowned does not disappear. It returns through the shadow. Vulnerability that was never welcomed back into consciousness begins to express itself indirectly as dominance, rigidity, or emotional withdrawal. The softer capacities are not gone. They have simply been exiled and now circle the perimeter, waiting to be acknowledged. This is often where conflict increases. Not explosive conflict necessarily, but friction, small ruptures, micro breakups, tests of loyalty that resemble reenactments rather than resolutions. Some clinicians describe men unconsciously recreating their parents' divorce through repeated relational resets, pulling away before being left, destabilizing closeness before it demands exposure. The trigger underneath is loss of control paired with fear of exposure. Exposure not as humiliation, but as being seen without armor, as being known without function. For someone whose identity formed around holding things together, that kind of visibility can feel threatening. Certain signals tend to cluster here: a growing obsession with certainty, discomfort with ambiguity, a need to define outcomes quickly, an intolerance for emotional gray zones where nothing is resolved yet. These are not moral failings. They are protective reflexes that once had a job. But eventually, control reaches its limit. Life introduces variables that cannot be managed through vigilance alone. Relationships resist optimization, meaning refuses to be forced. And when control fails, the psyche faces a crossroads: either double down on rigidity or confront what control was compensating for all along. This confrontation is rarely dramatic. It often arrives as fatigue, as disillusionment, as a quiet sense that the old strategies no longer stabilize anything. The illusion of stability cracks, not because it was foolish, but because it was incomplete. At this point, many experience a subtle grief, not just for lost relationships, but for the version of themselves that carried so much responsibility without support. The realization dawns slowly. What looked like strength may have been survival wearing a crown. This is not a collapse. It is an opening. Because when control loosens, not all at once but enough, the deeper question emerges. If stability cannot be enforced from the outside, where does it come from? If leadership cannot rest solely on vigilance, what replaces it? What follows is not weakness, but a search for meaning that no longer depends on holding everything together alone. There is a particular kind of disorientation that appears when control no longer holds. Not panic, not despair, something quieter. A sense that the internal map you relied on for years no longer explains where you are, or why familiar efforts keep failing to produce the same results. For many adults shaped by early rupture, identity was organized around stability through effort. Be responsible, be reliable, be ahead of problems. This story worked for a long time. It created structure, it prevented collapse, it earned respect, until it didn't. When relationships begin to fracture despite competence, or when intimacy erodes under the weight of vigilance, the old narrative starts to thin. Control no longer stabilizes connection. Discipline no longer guarantees meaning. And the self, once anchored in function, begins to feel strangely hollow. This is an existential wound, not a personal failure. The collapse here is not about losing everything. It is about losing the explanation that once made everything make sense. The identity built around holding things together no longer answers the deeper question: what am I oriented toward now, if survival is no longer the primary task? Philosophers have long warned that meaning cannot be sustained by effort alone. Viktor Frankl spoke of responsibility not as burden, but as orientation, being answerable to something larger than avoidance of pain. Reframed through attachment trauma, this insight becomes even more precise. Meaning emerges not from willpower, but from relationship, first with oneself, then with others. Neuroscience quietly supports this shift. The brain's plasticity does not favor narratives that amplify shame or self-attack. It favors stories that reduce internal threat. When the nervous system senses compassion rather than coercion, integration becomes possible, not immediately, but organically. This is where grief enters differently. Not as something to get over, but as something that reorganizes values. Grief, when integrated, becomes orientation rather than weakness. It clarifies what matters. It reveals what was missing without demanding punishment for the past. Some cultures recognize this more explicitly. In certain non-Western traditions, post-divorce rites exist not to assign blame, but to restore communal containment. The individual is not left alone to figure it out. Meaning is rewoven through shared acknowledgement, symbol, and time. In more individualistic cultures, this work often happens internally, quietly. The urgency beneath it is familiar, a fear of repeating the past, a pressure to get it right this time. But meaning does not respond well to pressure. It responds to honesty. As the old story dissolves, a new possibility appears. Not a replacement identity, but a different posture. One that allows grief to inform rather than define. One that recognizes responsibility without self-erasure. One that no longer confuses control with care. This reframing does not erase the past. It changes its function. What once organized life around avoidance begins to organize it around values. The question subtly shifts from, how do I prevent collapse, to what is worth staying present for, even when certainty is gone. And in that shift, the inherited ending loosens its grip. There comes a moment, often quiet, often unnoticed by others, when the internal role finally loosens, not through confrontation, not through triumph, but through recognition. The recognition that you are no longer required to carry messages between divided inner authorities, that the internal parents, once locked in opposition, no longer need a mediator to keep the system from tearing itself apart. Something else becomes possible: integration. Integration does not mean erasing loyalty. It does not mean invalidating love for either side of your history. It means allowing those divided voices to reorganize around a single, self-authored axis, one center, one internal gravity that no longer shifts based on who might be disappointed. This is what psychological adulthood begins to resemble. Not rebellion, but authorship. For many who grew up between worlds, agency was postponed out of necessity. Decisions were shaped by impact rather than truth. Preferences were filtered through consequence. Over time, the sense of "I choose" weakened, replaced by "I manage." Reclaiming agency now does not require cutting ties with the past. It requires no longer living inside its emergency protocols. There is a difference between loyalty and self-erasure. Loyalty can remain clean and mature without demanding fragmentation. Love does not have to be divided to be preserved. It can be held from a place of coherence rather than vigilance. An image helps here, only one, because excess metaphors distract from integration. Imagine holding an umbrella for years, braced against a storm that once was real. The muscles learned the posture. The grip became automatic. One day, you realize the rain stopped long ago, not recently, years ago, and the strain you feel now is not from weather, but from holding something no longer needed. Letting the umbrella close does not deny that it once protected you. It honors its purpose by releasing it. This is how the legacy of divorce begins to change shape. It stops being destiny and becomes raw material. Material for individuation, for a self that no longer exists primarily to stabilize others, but to live in alignment with its own values, limits, and capacity for intimacy. Individuation in everyday language is the process of becoming one piece inside yourself. Not perfect, not finished, but no longer split for survival. It is the slow replacement of role-based identity with lived coherence. When this happens, something subtle shifts in relationships. Attraction reorganizes. Conflict no longer signals collapse. Peace no longer feels suspicious. It feels earned, not because life is simple, but because the nervous system is no longer carrying an old war forward. If something in this mapping touched a familiar place, if a memory, a sensation, or a long-held question finally found language, leave one signal below. Just a line. It helps others recognize what you've just named.